what actually makes a revolution? I mean, is it just about, overthrowing a government? Or is there something much deeper going on? A fundamental shift, maybe, in how we understand power, truth, even what it means to be human. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the incredibly complex world of revolutions. We've pulled together a really fascinating stack of sources that challenge and expand our understanding of what a revolution truly is, how it might be justified or not,
Yeah,
and what its true aims might actually be.
that's right. And this deep dive, it isn't just about historical dates and, famous battles. Our mission is really to examine the very fabric of power itself and the role of truth in shaping societies and that enduring human quest for self-determination. We'll explore dramatically different philosophical viewpoints.
Yeah.
From those who condemn revolution outright, saying it's just a recipe for chaos, to those who see it as a necessary, maybe even a positive force for change. By the end, you'll hopefully have a much richer, more nuanced understanding of these transformative moments in history and, well, their surprising relevance to our world today.
And we're going to look at some truly intriguing contrasts. We'll explore why some brilliant minds see revolution as this catastrophic risk that could just plunge society into anarchy,
Right.
while others view it as, like, a crucial path to moral progress. We'll also unpack the dramatic differences between how Marxist and anarchist movements approach the whole idea of overthrowing a state, and even dive into concepts like nonviolent resistance and the powerful idea of a decolonizing revolution. Okay, so let's unpack this big idea first. What exactly is a revolution? It's a term we throw around a lot, but it clearly means different things to different people. How do our sources help us define it?
Well, at its most basic level, the material we looked at tells us a revolution involves a profound, pretty rapid change in the political order. And crucially, this change is achieved through force, right? Not through consensus or some kind of legal process. It's fundamentally about rejecting the existing government's authority
Okay.
and attempting to replace it with a new one across its entire territory.
So it's definitely more than just simple resistance, which could just be partial.
Exactly.
And it's also distinct from, say, a mere rebellion, which might reject authority but doesn't necessarily aim to replace the whole government system.
Right. No new blueprint, necessarily.
And it's certainly different from secession, which is about creating a new territorial unit altogether.
Yeah.
You can see why the American colonists, for instance, call themselves revolutionaries, not secessionists or rebels. They weren't just trying to split off. They were aiming to fundamentally replace the type of government they had.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. And some of our sources take it even further, arguing for what they call a stronger sense of revolution. For them, a revolution isn't truly a revolution unless it fundamentally changes the type of government, like, replacing an autocracy with a democracy.
Okay. So for some, maybe the American Revolution might not even count in that stronger sense if you see it as just replacing one sort of bourgeois state with another.
That's the argument some make, yeah.
Huh. That really complicates things right from the start, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder who gets to decide what counts as revolutionary enough.
Exactly. Others, of course, would strongly argue it was revolutionary precisely because it created a republic and a new form of self-governance. This just highlights the inherent debate in even defining the term.
Right. Okay, so with such a dramatic, earth-shattering concept, naturally, philosophers have had some pretty strong opinions on whether revolution is ever justified. Let's start with those who definitely weren't fans.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how consistent some of the arguments against revolution have been over centuries, often rooted in this deep fear of chaos. You have thinkers like Augustine, Aquinas, and especially Thomas Hobbes, who argued that the risk of violent anarchy following an attempted revolution is just so immense that it simply outweighs any purported justification for it. Hobbes famously saw life without an absolute sovereign as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, a war of all against all, basically.
So order above all else.
Pretty much. The key insight from Hobbes is that for him, any government, even a tyrannical one, is better than no government at all. Order is paramount, even if it costs you freedom.
So it's a radical prioritization of stability. But then you have Kant, who takes a different tack, almost a legalistic approach, to say revolution is never okay.
Right, precisely. Immanuel Kant offered this really powerful conceptual argument. He argued revolution is never justified, regardless of how abusive the power is.
Wow.
Never. Because for him, it's always contrary to law and fundamentally abolishes the entire legal constitution. You see, for Kant, individual enforcement of rights is impermissible. You need a state's omnilateral will, its collective supreme authority for mutual freedom. The surprising insight here is that for Kant, the ultimate act of revolution, by dismantling the legal system, actually destroys the very framework that allows for freedom and rights in the first place. It's this radical prioritization of the rule of law over fixing immediate problems.
Wow, okay. So if some of the greatest minds say it's never justified, who dares to argue for it? And on what grounds?
Well, a really prominent voice for revolution in the liberal tradition was John Locke. He put forward what's often called the self-defense argument. He asserted that revolution is justified when the state breaches its duty to protect natural rights, life, liberty, and estate or property.
The social contract idea.
Exactly. For Locke, the state acts as a trustee for the people. And if that trust is breached, rights return to civil society, allowing people to defend themselves with force. And what's interesting, in a direct contrast to Hobbes, is that Locke was far more optimistic that society wouldn't just collapse into chaos, even if the political order did. He believed in the underlying capacity of civil society to sort of self-organize.
So the people themselves are the ultimate check on power, in Locke's view. What about Hannah Arendt? Her perspective on revolution always feels a bit unique, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Hannah Arendt viewed revolutions not just as, historical events, but as a sign of political decay, a dramatic rupture that ushers something genuinely new into the world. Her work notably compares the French and American revolutions, asking these really profound questions about whether it's possible to found stable political institutions that can actually embody the spirit of revolution.
That initial spark.
Yeah, that initial bust of freedom and collective action without losing it over time. It's a tough needle to thread. And then, of course, you have the Marxist perspective, which kind of shifts the entire conversation. For Marx, revolution isn't so much about moral justification,
Right.
as it is about historical inevitability. It's presented more like a scientific explanation for why a specific kind of revolution, driven by class struggle and overcoming alienation, must occur to transition from capitalism to communism.
So the justification question almost becomes irrelevant.
In a sense, yes. The question of whether it's justified becomes almost beside the point. It simply will happen as a natural outcome of historical forces, according to the theory.
That's a huge distinction. If it's historically inevitable, does that completely remove the question of whether it's right or wrong for the individuals involved? Does it sort of take away human choice or the idea of ethical responsibility in revolution?
That's precisely the tension, isn't it?
Yeah.
For Marxists, the ethical imperative becomes aligned with the historical trajectory. Individuals are seen as participating in an unavoidable process.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a little unsettling for some. When we talk about revolution, we often think about power as something held by, like, a king or a government, a clear instrument wielded by someone specific. But our sources introduce us to Michel Foucault, who offers a much more pervasive, almost invisible idea of power. So what's the big idea here? What's Foucault getting at?
Foucault truly revolutionized our understanding, or at least offered a radically different lens. He moved away from viewing power as just an instrument wielded by actors or contained in discrete structures like a parliament or a state. Instead, he saw it as diffuse, everywhere, embodied not just in laws or armies, but in discourse, in knowledge, and in what he called regimes of truth.
Regimes of truth.
Yeah, power for him isn't something one possesses. It's something that is enacted in our daily lives, through our interactions, through institutions. The real insight here, I think, is that power actually makes us who we are.
That's kind of mind-bending. So when you say regimes of truth, what does that actually look like in practice? Is it like what society collectively decides is true at any given time?
Pretty much, yeah. Foucault's concept of power knowledge suggests that power is deeply intertwined with what society accepts as truth, as legitimate knowledge. Every society has its own regime of truth, which determines what counts as true knowledge and how that truth is sanctioned, who gets to speak it. Think about how medical truths have changed over centuries.
Well, definitely.
What was considered fact about the body or illness centuries ago is now seen completely differently. This is constantly reinforced and redefined through education, media, prevailing ideologies. So, the battle for truth isn't really about some absolute discoverable truth out there, but about the rules that separate true from false and attach effects of power to what is considered true. It makes you wonder how many of our daily choices are actually dictated by these unseen regimes of truth,
So power isn't just about repression then, telling you no or censoring you. It sounds like it can be productive too, in his view.
Precisely. That's a key Foucault point. He argued that power isn't just negative, excluding, repressing, censoring. On the contrary, he said it's immensely productive. It produces reality itself, it produces domains of objects like mental illness or criminality, and it produces rituals of truth like confessions or scientific experiments. It's what shapes individuals, their identities, and the very knowledge we gain about them. It literally creates the subjects it governs. He pointed to disciplinary power in seemingly benign systems like schools, hospitals, and prisons that emerged particularly in 18th century Europe. These systems of surveillance and assessment, of normalization, made people discipline themselves without the need for overt force.
Right, like internalizing the rules.
Exactly. And he introduced biopower, which subjugates physical bodies as a microcosm of wider social control, creating discursive practices that define what's normal or deviant. Think about how modern medicine defines what a healthy body is, or how psychology defines normal behavior. These are all forms of biopower shaping individuals and populations.
That goes so far beyond just traditional politics, doesn't it? This is about how society itself operates at a really fundamental level.
It really does. Foucault's approach sees power as an everyday, socialized, and embodied phenomenon. This is why state-centric power struggles, like many revolutions that just change who's in charge, don't always change the underlying social order. The deep structures of power remain. His ideas are crucial for recognizing how norms become so embedded that we discipline ourselves unconsciously. But crucially, and this is important, he also believed in the possibility of resistance, the capacity to recognize and question these socialized norms and constraints. Discourse itself, he suggests, can be a site of both power and resistance.
Okay, so if revolution is about changing these deeply embedded power structures, visible or invisible, how do people actually go about it? Our sources present this fascinating tension between violent and nonviolent approaches and raise some incredibly tough questions about the methods used.
Indeed. And one of the most influential proponents of a nonviolent approach, of course, was Martin Luther King Jr. His principles offer a profound ethical framework for resistance. He saw nonviolence not as passivity, but as a courageous way of life and active resistance to evil. He emphasized seeking friendship, understanding, and reconciliation to create what he called a beloved community.
A transformative vision.
Absolutely. King believed nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people, recognizing that evildoers are often also victims of the systems they inhabit. He held that suffering endured without retaliation can educate and transform, choosing love over hate, resisting violence of spirit as well as body. And underlying all this was this deep, unwavering faith that justice would eventually triumph.
King's vision is incredibly powerful, aiming to transform hearts, not just systems. But the reality is, many revolutions have involved significant conflict. How do these ideals of nonviolence square with what's known as just war theory, which tries to set ethical boundaries for violence, even in the revolutionary context?
That's a critical question that our sources definitely grapple with. Just war theory provides criteria, known as jus ad bellum, for justly going to war. Applying it to revolution is, well, it's a tight fit, let's say.
Okay.
Let's break it down. First, you need a just cause. This typically means facing what they call a resolute, severe tyranny, a regime that is persistently violating basic human rights, is wholly undemocratic, and completely impervious to reform.
A very high bar.
A very high bar. It's much harder to justify a revolution against lesser tyrannies that maybe only violate political rights simply due to the extremely high costs in lives that revolution entails. And a major complication here is that revolutionary goals might be indeterminate, Different factions might have conflicting aims, which can make the just cause very unclear even to those fighting.
Okay, so it has to be a truly dire situation. What about proportionality? That sounds like a tough one. How do you weigh lives lost against, say, political freedom?
Exactly. Second criterion. Proportionality. The good achieved must unequivocally outweigh the harms. And this is where it gets incredibly difficult, maybe impossible sometimes. Political rights often seem less urgent than the rights to life and limb that will inevitably be violated in a violent uprising. Now, some argue that lesser rights can aggregate to a significant cost over time, or that the regime's responsibility for initial violations lowers the proportionality threshold.
Right.
But revolutionary wars are often more violent and unpredictable than interstate wars. They carry a much higher risk of literal anarchy, which seriously raises the bar for justifying the bloodshed. It's a terrible calculus.
And then rightful authority. Who actually has the right to wage a revolutionary war? It's rarely a universally elected body, is it?
Exactly. That's a third criterion. Rightful authority. It's usually a small minority claiming to act in the name of the people, but how are they authorized, especially under oppressive regimes where no free expression is possible?
A huge challenge.
It is. This is particularly challenging in what some call Hobbesian contexts, where institutional structures for representation are completely absent. This often leads to violent struggles for leadership among revolutionary groups themselves. Some theorists argue this requirement shouldn't strictly apply in such extreme contexts, provided the group can create conditions for future legitimacy, but it's controversial.
And finally, necessity revolution has to be the absolute last resort.
Right.
No other way.
Precisely. Fourth, necessity. Revolution must be the only option available. This means existing institutions are so deeply flawed they are impossible to reform through less harmful means like protests, strikes, or civil disobedience. This is why discussions typically focus on extremely repressive regimes, where all other avenues for change are effectively blocked.
Okay, so beyond whether to go to war, there's also the question of how to fight it. What about the dirty tactics often associated with revolutionary movements, the kind of things that really test the ethical boundaries?
Yeah, that's where jus in bello, or justice in the conduct of war, comes in. And it gets very murky. Revolutionaries often resort to what are called irregular tactics, simply because they're at a significant disadvantage: less training, poorer arms, no safe zones. These can include things like civilian camouflage, where combatants appear as civilians to avoid detection, civilian disguise, using misleading appearances during actual combat, human shields, deliberately locating military targets near civilians, and even non-combatant targeting, which means intentionally harming civilians to instill terror, weaken support for the regime, or provoke the regime into overreacting.
These sound almost universally condemned in traditional warfare. Is there any argument, however thin, for their use in these specific contexts?
Well, while they are widely condemned for violating non-combatant immunity and proportionality, some very limited context-specific arguments have been made. For instance, some argue civilian camouflage might be permissible purely for fairness, to allow temporary withdrawal when facing an overwhelming enemy. It's about leveling the playing field slightly. Provoking the regime's brutality through certain acts, while morally hazardous, can also be seen by some as a desperate tactic to dissipate false consciousness among the populace, basically showing people the regime's true oppressive nature and hopefully galvanizing popular support. Revolutionaries might also resort to coercing support from the population, like conscripting fighters through the threat of property expropriation. This is sometimes argued as justifiable if the cause is just, the public good is extraordinary, recruitment is absolutely necessary for success, and the costs are distributed fairly. But that's a lot of ifs.
Very tricky.
Very. And then there's the really contentious concept of expansive discriminate targeting. Here, some argue that certain non-combatants who significantly contribute to maintaining the oppressive regime, maybe those supplying the secret police, for example, might lose their innocent status and become liable to harm if it's necessary and proportionate. The huge challenge here, of course, is defining significant contribution without it becoming a dangerously broad justification for targeting almost anyone.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly slippery. It seems like, despite these desperate arguments, there's still deep skepticism due to the high risk of abuse and the potential for a complete breakdown of any rules of war. It's a truly fraught ethical territory.
It absolutely is, and it highlights the extreme moral quandaries faced by those engaged in such struggles. There often aren't any clean choices.
So much of what we've discussed, from defining truth with Foucault to justifying action with just war theory, seems tied to belief systems. How do ideologies, these shared ways of seeing the world, actually fuel and shape revolutions?
Ideologies are incredibly powerful. They're essentially the engine. They provide the very framework for understanding the world, for identifying its problems, and crucially, for envisioning a completely new society. They are coherent sets of beliefs and attitudes that basically give people a shared evaluative map of the social world, telling them what's wrong, why it's wrong, and what needs to change.
And this map, this shared understanding, profoundly influences revolutionary movements, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It offers a scathing critique of the existing order, provides a compelling vision and a plan for change. It mobilizes crucial support, recruits activists, and directly guides strategies and tactics. It's truly the engine that drives collective action, giving purpose and direction to often disparate groups who might otherwise not work together.
Marxism is obviously a prime example here, right? It had a pretty clear blueprint for revolution.
It is, undoubtedly. Marxism, with its emphasis on class struggle, the proletariat leading the revolution, and the goal of establishing a socialist society, has been hugely influential throughout history, inspiring movements across the globe. However, our sources also highlight an inherent tension within revolutionary practice, this constant pull between strict ideological purity and, well, pragmatism.
Getting things done.
Yeah, strict adherence to ideology can sometimes hinder adaptation to changing circumstances on the ground, creating internal conflicts within movements, and sometimes making success elusive because reality doesn't quite match the theory.
So, beyond its influence on specific historical revolutions, how does revolutionary ideology continue to impact us today? Do these grand visions still resonate in modern movements?
Oh, they absolutely do. Revolutionary ideas, even if not explicitly labeled as such, still inspire movements focused on social justice, equality, and human rights. We see their echoes in significant movements like the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-apartheid struggle, anti-globalization protests, Black Lives Matter, and feminist movements. They provide the language and the moral framework for demanding fundamental change, even if the methods are often very different now. Now, what's fascinating is that while these ideas remain incredibly relevant, you also have postmodern and post-structuralist perspectives offering a critique of the very idea of a grand, singular revolution.
Right, like Foucault's ideas we discussed.
Exactly. They might argue it can be too simplistic or based on a flawed, linear understanding of history, emphasizing the complexity and diversity of social movements instead. But despite these critiques, that underlying emphasis on the need for radical change to achieve a better society continues to resonate deeply.
Okay. Let's turn to some perspectives that fundamentally rethink what success in revolution even means, and maybe how deep the transformation needs to go. Anarchists, for instance, have a very different take, especially after seeing how some Marxist revolutions played out historically.
They absolutely do. Anarchists offer a really powerful, even scathing critique of what are often called successful Marxist revolutions, thinking of places like Russia, China, Albania, Cuba. They argue that while these movements did manage to overthrow existing states, they often fundamentally failed to achieve their actual stated goals of a truly classless, free society. Instead, they frequently just replaced one authoritarian regime with another.
Trading one boss for another, essentially.
That's the anarchist critique, yes.
Yeah.
And they point to the frequent betrayal and purging of anarchists by Marxists in these revolutions, seeing it not as an accident, but as a predictable outcome of centralized, state-focused power grabs.
So for anarchists, simply taking power isn't the point at all. It's about something fundamentally different than just who's in charge.
Exactly. For anarchists, it's not about merely overthrowing a state to replace it with another, even a so-called proletarian state. It's about creating self-managed, stateless communities. Or, as some sources put it, carving out spaces where the state can no longer effectively interfere. Anarchism is described not as a fixed political endpoint, like communism aims to be, but as a non-coercive, continual dynamic process. True anarchism, they argue, cannot be forced or imposed from above by a vanguard party.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, our sources give fascinating examples. The Free Territory in Ukraine, run by the Black Army during the Russian Revolution, Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War until it was crushed by communists and fascists, the Zapatistas in Mexico who operate dual power systems alongside the Mexican state, and Rojava in northern Syria with its democratic confederalism. They even point to things like the open source software movement, like Wikipedia, as demonstrating mass voluntary collaboration happening effectively outside the logic of profit or state control. For anarchists, resisting hierarchy and exploitation in daily life, feeding the disadvantaged, democratizing education, fostering local autonomous communities, these actions are the true revolution. It embodies the famous idea. The means are the ends. The way you achieve freedom is the freedom itself. You build the new society within the shell of the old.
That's a really profound idea. The process itself is the goal. And this leads us quite nicely to another powerful, deeply rooted perspective mentioned in our sources, the philosophy of liberation. How does it connect to these broader ideas of profound, perhaps different kinds of change?
The philosophy of liberation, which originated in Argentina in the late 1960s, is presented as a crucial counter-narrative to dominant European thought, including some forms of Marxism. It starts not from abstract theory, but from what it calls the suffering corporality of our pueblos, our peoples, their lived experiences, their bodies, their pain. It sees the essence of politics not as statecraft, but as the production and development of human life, actively battling against modernity's imposition of domination, particularly in colonial and post-colonial contexts.
So it's very much grounded in lived experience, particularly of oppression.
Precisely. And it critiques forms of Eurocentric Marxism for sometimes interpreting reality too dogmatically, often missing the complex reality of concrete, historical, oppressed people, especially indigenous communities or those marginalized in other ways. This philosophy explicitly walks alongside Latin American movements that seek true liberation, providing a framework for understanding them on their own terms. Movements such as the Cuban Revolution and its popular aspects, Sandinismo in Nicaragua embracing popular culture and religiosity, and Zapatismo in Mexico deepening understanding through ancestral indigenous cultures. It tries not to impose external ideological models.
And this links to the idea of a decolonizing revolution.
Yes, very much so. It connects to Che Guevara's powerful idea that a revolution needs both objective changes, changing structures, and a fundamental transformation of subjectivity to create a new human being, free from internalized oppression. It emphasizes that what's truly needed is a decolonizing revolution, which goes much deeper than just political independence. A core concept borrowed from the Zapatistas, which influenced many movements, is that true power is ultimately the command to obey the people. It's a revolutionary inversion of traditional top-down power.
Power flows upwards.
Exactly. This idea profoundly influenced movements like the attempt to build a plurinational state in Bolivia, which explicitly aimed for a true decolonizing revolution. The ultimate goal, as articulated there, is to think the world from life, recognizing nature not as a resource to dominate, but as a mother from which we come, a source of our deepest essence. It's about recovering that fundamental connection, not just changing who's in charge of the state apparatus.
That idea of thinking from life and redefining power as the command to obey, that's truly a radical shift. It makes you wonder what kind of world that would actually build. And thinking about these different struggles, with all these different ideas about revolution floating around, what happens when other countries or external groups decide to get involved? Is foreign intervention ever justified in another country's revolutionary struggle? That seems incredibly contentious.
Oh, it's a truly complex and ethically thorny area, absolutely. Given the asymmetrical nature of most revolutionary wars, rebels versus established states, foreign military assistance can often be absolutely crucial for the revolutionary survival, let alone success. However, as our sources emphasize, there are significant moral limitations and huge debates surrounding such intervention. There's a big debate centered around the principle of self-determination. Michael Walzer, a prominent theorist here, famously argued that respect for collective self-determination severely limits intervention. He argued it's only justifiable in supreme humanitarian emergencies, like ongoing genocide. This creates what he called an asymmetry. A revolution might be morally justified in response to oppression below this extreme threshold, but intervention by an outside force would not be. The core idea is that a people must make their own revolution. It can't be imported.
So on one hand, a people might have the right to fight for their freedom against severe oppression. But on the other hand, outsiders are mostly supposed to stay out, even if they sympathize with the cause. That seems like a real moral bind for everyone involved.
It absolutely is. However, others, like the philosopher Alan Buchanan, counter this strict view. They argue against rigid constraints like needing clear popular support or explicit consent for intervention, pointing out that oppressed populations face enormous obstacles to expressing these openly under a tyranny. You can't exactly hold a referendum.
Good.
Buchanan suggests intervention could potentially be justified in certain cases, maybe to preempt massive wrongdoing, perhaps to establish conditions where people can express support later, or even to promote self-determination for future generations who are currently unable to make that choice. Some sources go even further, proposing a kind of symmetry argument. They say that if the general principles for justly waging war, just ad bellum, are met by the situation within the country, then intervention is justified, regardless of strict self-determination concerns. Essentially, the justification for revolution and intervention align. They argue that a revolutionary vanguard group often bears a similar ethical relationship to the people claiming to represent them without explicit consent as a foreign actor might.
That's a controversial parallel.
It is. Finally, another view sees intervention more as a potential supplement to revolution. In this perspective, it's justified only if the beneficiaries, the oppressed people, cannot realistically secure their own rights, and domestic revolutionary leaders cannot succeed alone. It acts as a necessary support system for an otherwise justifiable internal struggle. So it's not about imposing a revolution from outside, but aiding one that already has a legitimate internal basis and needs help to succeed.
Okay, so we've journeyed through these complex definitions, ancient philosophical debates, the subtle and pervasive nature of power via Foucault, and the contrasting paths of violent and nonviolent change, right down to rethinking what revolution even means with anarchist and decolonial ideas. What really stands out to you after diving deep into all these different sources?
What stands out most powerfully to me is how this deep dive really shows that the ethics of revolution and intervention are just so deeply intertwined with the hard facts about how large-scale political change actually occurs in the real world. There's no single easy answer to is revolution justified? Because the risks and benefits vary wildly depending on the specific context, whether you're in a situation closer to Hobbes' nightmare world, teetering on the brink of total chaos, or something more like Locke's view, where there's some underlying institutional order, some civil society left to build on.
Right. It really seems like to truly understand revolution,
Yeah.
you need more than just abstract theory. You need to get your hands dirty with the messy reality of it all.
Exactly. A truly robust understanding requires combining that profound philosophical insight we've discussed with a detailed, empirically grounded understanding of social scientific theories about how societies actually change, how movements mobilize, what factors lead to success or failure, and crucially, whether those changes truly lead to a morally better order in the long run. It's an ongoing, deeply human question that demands both deep ethical thought and a really realistic, maybe even cynical at times, look at how the world works and how incredibly messy and unpredictable change can be.
And perhaps the most thought-provoking idea that emerges from our sources, at least for me, is that call, particularly from the philosophy of liberation, to think the world from life, where nature isn't just a thing to be dominated or exploited, but the very source of our deepest essence. And maybe revolution is ultimately about recovering that connection. Makes you wonder, what does a truly decolonizing revolution look like in practice, beyond just changing flags or governments? And how might that kind of transformation redefine our understanding of power, of justice, and ultimately what it truly means for humanity to flourish on this planet?